Our topic is building hope through faith during the racial and health crises, which is pretty much on everybody's mind 24/7 these days. And our guests are Jim Antal, who's an advisor on climate justice to the UCC, Reverend Arnold Thomas from the Good Shepherd Lutheran Church in Jericho, and Rabbi Jan Salzman from the congregation Ruach haMaqom, and I'm sure I didn't get that right, but she will correct me. And so we're just going to go right to this, and we're going to start out with Jim Antal. So Jim, take it away.
Well, thank you very much, and it's a real pleasure to be here. I've been a member or involved in the Sierra Club since I first hiked out in the Sierras on the John Muir Trail, I think when I was 15 years old back in 1965. So I have a lot of admiration for what you folks do. And I also had the privilege of being arrested with Michael Brune in 2013 when the Sierra Club set aside its long-standing prohibition on civil disobedience. He and I and 45 others were arrested on the White House gates, then attempting to convince then President Obama to stop the Keystone XL pipeline. And if any of you want to ask any questions about any of that, I'm more than glad to respond to that. But right now, I think for my opening comments, I want to talk a little bit about the intersectionality of racial justice, economic justice, and environmental justice. If there's anything for me that's really significant about this moment in the justice movement, it is that each of those what had been significantly siloed justice efforts, they are all coming together as we recognize what 15-year-old climate activist Alexandria Villaseñor, I think, has put best to put them all together. And I'm quoting her when I say, the exploitation of Black people is the greatest extractive system of production of all time. And in that handful of words, I think what we really get is how racial justice, economic justice, and environmental justice are all connected. My denomination, the United Church of Christ, has been involved with environmental justice as well as economic justice and racial justice. But just to say a little bit about our involvement in environmental justice and our own sense of intersectionality, back in 1987, we wrote a report which was titled Toxic Wastes and Race, in which we did the demographic, the first demographic study to identify that the toxic waste dumps throughout the United States are located by and large in communities of color. That report actually was quoted on the first line of a 16-page climate justice policy statement that Elizabeth Warren issued toward the end of her campaign as a candidate for president. So it's gotten a lot of recognition. I'd be more than glad to respond to any other questions you may have about that, but I'm aware that we convened around the topic of hope. And I just want to say one quick word about hope and then turn this over to one of our other guests. And that is, hope is often confused with optimism. A couple of years ago, I published a book, Climate Church, Climate World, and there are hundreds of congregations that are reading it. And in there, I toss out the idea that hope has anything to do with optimism, following the lead of many rabbis and William Sloane Coffin and others who have said that. I think the best way we can understand hope is to understand hope as engagement, and to recognize hope as a muscle, which we are, as people of faith, obligated to exercise in order to make stronger. And I know this may sound like a theological cop-out, but the person in my orbit who best understands hope is Greta Thunberg. And her comments about hope, when she stands up in front of the UN General Assembly and she stands up in front of the richest people in the world in Davos on 2 different occasions, and she tells them, I don't want your hope. I want you to act like your house was on fire. When she says that to them, she is expressing for me what I would hope all people of faith throughout the world might live into, recognizing that it's not only the case that individuals have a calling, like you may have a calling to be a doctor, and another person might have a calling, to do some other profession. Right now, our generation has a calling. And that calling is that we need to be, to recognize that we have intergenerational responsibilities. And to express our hope, to live into that hope, we need to act on those intergenerational responsibilities. And at least for me, I find no one more inspirational than Greta Thunberg. I'll leave that as my opening comments. And as I said, I'm glad to respond to anybody who has questions.
Thank you so much, Jim. Reverend Thomas, let's go to you.
Well, you should also know that I'm a United Church of Christ minister serving a Lutheran church. So we may have an unhealthy majority of UCC ministers around here. But I also want to cite the report of the Racial Justice Commission of the United Church of Christ back in 1987 regarding the prevalence of toxic sites in areas predominated by people of color. A clear example and most publicized example of this was the Alabama Supreme Court case decision against the Monsanto company. Although Anniston, in the area of Anniston, Alabama, and although Anniston itself is predominantly white area, the area surrounding the Monsanto facility is predominantly made up of low-income Black residents. And the residents contended that, and the court agreed, that the Monsanto for years knowingly polluted the area, flushing tens of thousands of pounds of PCBs and other toxic waste into the Snow Creek, sending the chemicals through long-established neighborhoods. People were swimming and baptizing their children in these waters. The reality is that areas populated by poor white, Black, and brown residents are least able to resist well-funded corporate chemical companies like Monsanto. The land within these areas are also the cheapest to purchase for their facilities, and the people are most needy of jobs. So in many ways, people who are victimized by corporate chemical companies are encouraged not to bite the hand that feeds them until the death toll becomes so intimately and obviously clear that the hand that feeds them is also the hand that's killing them. For the last 4 years, people of color throughout the country have faced the fact that the federal entities of our government, from whom we have often turned to protect us from such callous corporate disregard, now controls the judicial, executive, and legislative branches and the agencies that report to them, including the EPA. However, for people of color, human rights battles are age-old struggles that throughout the history of this nation only saw a few brief shining moments of hope, including the years of Reconstruction following the Civil War, when African Americans assumed prominent political, economic, and social influence as to effect great change in behalf of poor and underrepresented people throughout the country, which was then retracted at the election of Rutherford B. Hayes. The second moment was during the 15 years of the Warren Supreme Court, when important civil rights legislation was passed by Congress and upheld by the highest court in the land, but once again retracted by more conservative administrations, starting with the Nixon and Nixon administration and the Burger Court, up through the present occupant of the White House and the Roberts Court. The third moment was the Obama administration, which, despite uphill battles in the House, Senate, and Supreme Court, exercised unprecedented amount of executive privileges on behalf of people of color, including the possibility of regaining a majority of progressive justices on the Supreme Court. That, once again, inspired hope for the future among people of color. But once again, such hope was dashed by the election of Trump and the retraction of crucial civil rights legislation. The murder of George Floyd, caught on video thanks to a concerned bystander, had the same effect of the mother of Emmett Till, who decided to have her son's casket opened so that the world could see the gross disfigurement, white lynching perpetrated upon her son. It had the same effect of a worldwide broadcast of police dogs and power hoses being unleashed against peaceful civil rights protesters. It had the same effect of the worldwide broadcast of buses occupied by students and young adults traveling south to join the civil rights cause being torched by angry white Southern mobs. There was, after each of these incidents, a moment of hope that the world would rise up in righteous outrage against the violent injustice that has been directed against Black Americans for centuries. But the outrage was only momentary, as whites faced the reality that to embrace human rights changes too seriously meant that they would have to change a form of government and lifestyle on which they had grown too dependent. Most Vermonters don't have a clue of their history as it relates to Black and Brown and Indigenous Vermonters who have been here as long or longer than the life of the state itself. As a result, they have fabricated a false narrative of Vermont as a state that entered the Union outlawing slavery, a false narrative of Vermont as an open-minded, progressive, and hospitable state for all people. It is a false narrative because it lacks the perspective of Black, Brown, and Indigenous Vermonters. If significant and lasting change is to occur in this state, we must start with passage of a reparations bill in the State House, which many white Vermonters and Americans believe to be a legislation that will determine how much back payment the government owes Black people for the blood, sweat, tears, and personal sacrifices of a nation and economy founded on slave labor. I firmly believe that one cannot exact a price tag on that level of sacrifice, but one can nonetheless begin the process of reparations as a nation and a better accounting of how we move forward, starting with a better accounting of how we got into this mess. And that is the fundamental premise and starting point of reparations. We are a nation that was founded by a majority of wealthy slaveholders who never suspected or hoped to assume equality with people of color, who established judicial, legislative, and executive branches to preserve and protect their interests from those of people of color and the poor. And if we check our history, you will discover that little has changed from that foundation. As faith institutions, we must provide forms of action that advocate the peaceful overhaul of a system that favors the wealthy few, to reform it into a system that favors the commonwealth of all. To do that, we must consider radical change, and the church and faith institutions must provide the forum that advocates for that peaceful overhaul. of an unjust, immoral government. Thank you.
Oh, thank you, Reverend Thomas. And I know that as speaking from the viewpoint of the Sierra Club as an environmental group that has long been very white, and among that class that you described, that we are on that journey to talk about what you were just talking about. So that brings us to Rabbi Salzman. So welcome.
Thank you. So I'm Rabbi Jan Salzman from Ruach haMaqom in the heart of the Old North End in Burlington. We are a new congregation, having begun in 2016. And I come from, my training is through the Jewish Renewal Movement, which is a post-denominational form of Judaism that was born with the seeds of what came over from Europe and was planted here in this soil with the information of my youth, of the 60s and the 70s, of environmentalism, of the earth as an ecological Gaia, of feminism, of equal access under the law, of all of these ideals which we had all grown up with, at least of my age. And so it's non-denominational. And so quite often people say, well, are you Reformed Jew? Are you, Orthodox? I know we're done with that. We're done with the denominations, because at this point, at least from the Jewish perspective, we are an intrafaith and an interfaith body of people. So it involves also the integration of the entire mystical system as well. So every seminary has its own flavor, and my seminary really emphasized the mystical, the works of Kabbalah and of our Hasidic masters, which informs what I'm going to say here in terms of hope. Certainly as a people that has been violently oppressed since at least the 4th century, if not before, by a profoundly aggressive Catholicism, Christianity, who had a narrative that, according to the 1216 Lateran Council, since we didn't accept Jesus, we couldn't be killed off, but because we didn't accept Jesus, we were supposed to suffer. So we have and there's a lot to say about whether Jews were the people of color at different times, whether we could assimilate. It wasn't always true that we could assimilate, that we could pass in the society. Depends what century, what country you're talking about. But there is a profound trajectory of hope from a people that no matter what we did, we were the other. And for Jews in this country, we thought we had found a safe place. And it turns out we haven't. And so I just want to set that stage for my remarks about hope, because there's an incredible wisdom that my people have brought to the table, fully acknowledging, of course, that when we did assimilate and when we were able to pass, we acted just as awfully and poorly as anybody else. But the general thrust of our people is having come from a place of great oppression and slaughter at the hands of our oppressors. So I set that out. One of the things that I find that gives us hope is our attitude about revenge. If you think in your pain that you can go out and commit acts of revenge towards those who have hurt you, you are only going to perpetuate even more suffering. And so one of the most fascinating things that I find about the Jewish trajectory is what we have done with the natural human impulse for revenge. And so how do we deal with the fact that all this suffering was happening? What did we do with that as a people? And one of the things that we did with it as a people was we had this constant information of because we were slaves unto Pharaoh in Egypt, we know what it's like to be oppressed. That shows up every 5 minutes in Jewish liturgy. It is the zeitgeist of how our people have developed, and therefore an enforced compassion. No matter what you've gone through, do not forget that you were oppressed. And therefore, 36 times it says in the Hebrew Bible, you shall not treat the stranger, you shall not oppress the stranger, because you remember what it was like. So that is one source of dismantling the impulse for revenge. The other happens within the Jewish community, in our liturgy. A number of times a day, we get to express our wish for a revenge, but in that expression, we actually dissipate its energy. And in fact, there's a prayer that we say 3 times a day, which was a later prayer that was added to one of our core pieces of liturgy that we think was added somewhere around the 3rd century. We wish that all those who were oppressing us would, God, go get them, God. You know, we hope that you'll make them, you'll get rid of them, and you'll relieve our suffering. But the summation statement of that prayer is, dear God, please dismantle our oppressors' arrogance. In other words, humility is the key to not carrying out acts of revenge. The other thing that I find interesting is that how Jews count time. What is a day? A day for many people begins at dawn, but in Jewish counting, the day starts the night before. In other words, the next day starts in the darkness of the evening before. You wait till 3 stars are out, and now you know the next day has begun. And we get this from the text in Genesis that says it was evening and it was morning one day, it was evening and morning 2 days. So that's the pace. But out of darkness comes the beginning of the next day. And I think that one of the sources of hope is that no matter what's gone on in the day, we start the next day that night, and we begin to let go of whatever happened to us in the day, and we begin the next day, the night before, in the darkness. And I can talk a lot more about that, but it's a profoundly healing pace, a calendar pace of how do I let go of what has happened to me and us during the day. The other thing that's really powerful is that the Jewish people have not, do not, and have never engaged with the words of Torah literally. And therefore, when we come in contact and we come up against a piece of text that is disturbing to us, you better believe it was disturbing to thousands of years of other people being disturbed by that text. And so we have created this tradition of midrash, of creative problem solving. We see a hole in the text and we come up with a story to explain that hole. But the bottom line is that we don't take things literally. And then after the destruction of the Second Temple by the Romans in 70 CE, the rabbinic period begins. And the rabbinic period is, which continues to this day, but the Talmud is this complete recasting of how we engage with the text, to never take anything literally. And the other thing that happens when you do that is that there are a lot of opinions about how you don't take things literally. And therefore, if you've ever seen a page of Talmud, which is the collection of the rabbinic salon, the rabbinic conversation that was collected over the first 600-700 years from the fall of the temple until about 600 CE. You've got a little piece of text in the middle of the page, and then you've got everybody's opinions around the parameters. And the person on the left margin doesn't agree with the person on the right margin. In other words, the map that Jews develop is to care more about the next question than we do about the last answer. This is a profound state of attitude because we don't care about the last answer. We care about the next question. How more can we discern meaning out of what we're discussing? And the tangential thoughts that happen in that rabbinic mind is the ore, is the core, is what we mine for our creative ideas. So when I was asked to be on this panel, they said, what is your source of hope? For me, it's how I look at what seems to be cemented in place, a narrative. And the narrative has got us by our necks because we as a society keep dragging that stuff along with us with wishes for not knowing how to ask the next question. And it's the source of that question that is the source of the hope. Because if we can ask a different question, we have the possibility of coming up with at least the next set of answers that we're going to work on, which of course in that pure dialectical form give us the next questions. So for me, the source of hope, and I think for my people, the source of hope is that we're never stuck where we are. We're always reaching for the next iteration, using a word that seems to be popular these days, iteration. The final thing I want to say in this introduction is that the idea that the Torah talks about, that the earth itself gets a Sabbath, the Shemitah year, is powerful. That we are stewards of the land, and we, as we reap things from the land itself gets a Sabbath once every 7 years. And then once every 50 years, we're supposed to return the land to its original owners and forgive all debt. Now, we understand that that never really happened, but it's an ideal that the calendar of Torah reading holds. Because when we get to that part of the Torah, we are emphatically told that the foundation of a healthy economic and agricultural system is that you respect the land and you make sure that people are not caught in debt to the point where they can't get out. So I go back to Torah, and I go back to the conversations. I go back to the next questions in order to find that seed of hope. The Hatikva, which of course was the national anthem of Israel way back before the state of Israel even, was a glimmer, right? So the national anthem was all about hope, that we can make the world a better place, but in really clear steps, and not pie in the sky kind of stuff, but to admit that we are responsible for what's going on. And then the ideals of B'Tselem Elohim, we're all created in the image of God, and that the earth itself gets a Sabbath, an entire year off, where you're not even supposed to dig a hole. And so I think I'll conclude my remarks with that, and thank you.
Well, thank you, Rabbi Salzman. Much to ponder there. Thought reparations is not a bad question to be asking.
Yeah.
Well, before we go further, I just wanted to mention quickly, Richard Butts is with us. Richard is in the crowd there somewhere. I just want to express appreciation for Richard, who sort of pulled this evening together for us. So thank you very much, Richard, for your contribution here. And then I think what I'd like to do is to go to Jack Cushman to get us going with questions. And And I said, I see we have a hand or two up, but we'll go to Jack and then come to questions from the group. Jack.
Okay, thank you. And thanks to our presenters. I always learn a lot here, and tonight is no exception. When I read Pope Francis's encyclical, his environmental encyclical, a few years ago, one part of it jumped out at me. And rather than read it, I think I'll try to paste it in the chat and then just ask my question around it. If I'm lucky, this will happen. And what Pope Francis was saying was about the need for us to change our lifestyles. But what jumped out at me about his comment was when he said, this is what consumer movements accomplish by boycotting certain products. And I thought it was really striking. Of course, in the Catholic and in other religious social movement backgrounds, such as when I was a kid, the boycott of grapes by the United Farm Workers and Cesar Chavez, boycotts have had a very powerful place. And in climate policy, we hear a lot about disinvestment, and indeed the Catholic Church, the Church of England, and other churches and other institutions have been disinvesting from fossil fuels. But I've never heard much about boycotting fossil fuels. And I'd like to hear from our faith leaders here a little discussion of whether consumer pressure, such as boycott, is something that intersects well with other moral decisions, because what Francis says here is that purchasing is always a moral and not simply an economic act. So I'd welcome a little discussion from the three of you on that.
I'm glad to start things off on that. It's a great question. Two things come to my mind. First of all, as some participants in this Zoom session may be aware, the most recent campaign by 350.org and countless other organizations, including the Sierra Club, is referred to as the Stop the Money Pipeline. And what it amounts to, Jane Fonda has probably been the person, most famous person who has made a video of herself cutting her Chase card, her credit card, in half, because JP Morgan Chase is the biggest funder of fossil fuel infrastructure. So by cutting her credit card in half, she and thousands of others are in fact boycotting the utilization of Chase, the convenience of that credit card. One other example is the no-fly movement. There's a movement among climate scientists and other climate activists to reduce or even give up flying. And while that isn't a direct boycott against this or that specific airline, it is a boycott against the convenience and the pleasurability, if you will, of being able to move your body physically to a place. We've all, in a sense, experienced a little bit of this, and there's a lot of people scratching their heads like, why would I need to fly again? Which is, in a way, a fundamental boycott kind of question. So those are at least two perspectives, and Arnold or Jan may have additional ones.
So one of the things I always teach is every time you spend $1, you're voting. Every dollar that you spend is a vote. Back in the day, I was a certified organic farmer, and when NOFA was just beginning, and it was really clear then that every dollar that you spent was a vote for a certain kind of agricultural practice. You were either going to support, your money was either going to go to industrial conventional farming techniques with poor wages, bad worker conditions, and just awful food, or you were going to spend your dollar on locally produced, organic, healthy foods where we pay our workers and we make sure they have bathrooms, you know. I mean, just, so every dollar that I spend is a vote. And if I think of it that way, then without a doubt, boycotts are the money I'm not spending to support destructive industries. And the money I am spending goes to supporting those industries and that agriculture and that commerce that is at least more nurturing to the planet and to our fellow creatures than otherwise. So yes, yes, sir.
That's an interesting comment. And what I was thinking as I listened to you, I was reminiscing about when I was, I don't know, 14 years old or something, and the farm labor movement was boycotting grapes. And I went home filled with righteous zeal by the Jesuits of Massachusetts, and said to my mother, "You've got to stop boycotting grapes. You've got to start boycotting grapes. We've got to stop eating grapes." And I thought that this was a very radical thing to say. And she looked at me and she said, "Do you know that they make children work in those fields?" And she stopped buying grapes. And it's just an easy sell. If you can reach that level of boycotting carbon, then I think you could go a long way. I'm sorry to add more than my due here.
And I'd like to just say one more thing. I think the whole idea around boycott is that of understanding the community and the environment from which you get your produce, of the individuals who create that produce and sell that produce, a better understanding of the community, the social as well as the ecological environment in which you live and appreciate. And it's not necessarily directed at boycotting a particular product, but making sure the product that you receive has been grown and supported in a way that supports the community around it. And that we don't have enough information about. And I think that's why there is a desire to support locally grown produce, a desire to move in a more organic direction, and I support that wholeheartedly. But I think undergirding even that is a sense that our whole society has been so much removed and divorced itself from the land, from the ecology, from the environment, that we now look upon it as a jungle rather than as a garden. Well, the jungle has only been created because we have ignored the garden. And it is time that we restored our sense of stewardship, not only with the environment around us, but the people who occupy it. And that, again, I think that involves a radical change in the way we see ourselves in relation to our community and ourselves in relation to our government, not only nationally, not only locally, but world.
Very well said. I think you could make the same case with regard to energy production and whether we want to import our power in the form of fossil fuels or from hydropower from 1,000 miles away. My feeling has always been, if you can see it in your backyard, you know what it's about and you're connected to it. We had a question here from Daniel. Daniel, you had your hand up a while ago. Do you still have that question? Are you still with us?
That was just clapping. That wasn't my hand up. Sorry.
Oh, okay. Okay. Well, great. Are there anybody else out there with a question or a comment?
I can ask a question, Steve.
Great, Rachel. Rachel
Hi,
is
everyone.
the chair of our Vermont Sierra Club chapter, for those who haven't met Rachel.
Hi. Thank you for this great discussion. I've been just really moved by these words, and I'm really glad to be here. So I was raised in the Presbyterian Church in my home in Atlanta, Georgia. But when I became a teenager, I moved away from the church, and I don't attend services anymore, much to the dismay of my grandmother. But I'm just, thinking, with the youth movement that's really growing in our country, and that the youth are really leading the way. I'm wondering how, do you see young people coming to your churches? Is there an effort to kind of harness that and to help focus that energy? Because I do think it's clearly there, and I see a lot of the moral values that are missing in our, economy and our politics in the young people. And I'm just wondering how you interact with youth in your congregations.
So one of the greatest surprises to me of when we started this congregation in 2016 was the number of young folk who came. We seem to have been able to capture that millennial cohort, and I'm still trying to scratch my head as to why. Other than they're my children's age, and maybe it was something about they got to hang out with their mom and dad, but it wasn't their mom and dad. So I have no idea how this actually works. But the beginning a synagogue out of whole cloth allows us to follow the people who show up. Because my basic question is, and this is something that those of us who are involved in the world of clergy, we are seeing the entire premises of what is a congregation, what is a community, being completely deconstructed. And because nobody can get together for services. We can't sing together, we can't congregate. And this is an unbelievable opportunity to reconstruct faith communities from the question that I'm asking is, what do younger people want? What does it mean for them to be part of a faith community? It's not going to look like my grandfather's shul, my grandfather's synagogue. That's gone. The hierarchical model is gone. That women were not in leadership is gone. That the planet is not taken into primary account is gone. That capitalism and oppression and white supremacy and all the other phrases that you can conjure over, right? So the excitement that I feel by basically making the space for the next generation to come in and create their own faith community I think that's my job. My job is to clean up the living room and have you guys bring your own Legos into the room. All right. You build it. And I have wisdom and I have the tradition and I can talk a good game. But the real question I have is, what is this going to look like when COVID has run its course? And one of the things that has driven me my entire professional life, whether I was a farmer or a landscaper or whatever it was I did, was that I was one of the first people to have a CSA back in the day, which was you ask the people what they want you to grow, you grow it, it's pre-sold, and we're done, right? This is that model of demand-driven markets, rather than me coming up with something that I want to create, and then I have to develop advertising to convince you to buy it, right? That's not demand-driven consumers. So Shauna Ratner up in Fairfield just published a new book, and she just had a book launch this week about exactly that, demand-driven economics. And so the young people who are coming to us feel like they own it because we're creating it together. And I have no idea what it's going to look like, So I think that's all I want to say.
Rachel, thanks for your question. I just want to give a quick comment and say that at least of our 5,000 congregations across the country in the United Church of Christ, we have now, I think, hundreds that have affiliated with a local Sunrise Movement chapter a local Extinction Rebellion chapter, a local Sierra Club chapter, a local 350 chapter, all of which, should I say without being too embarrassing, lower the average age in the room. And we're happy about that. And we're promoting that. The other thing I wanted to say is over in the chat box, Ryan has raised, I think, several profound questions, and Becky wondered maybe it would be good for us to address them. And one theme that is in several of the comments in the chat boxes is the reality that the challenges we are facing with environmental justice, with racial justice, and with economic justice are all systemic challenges. And while we have spent said some very good things the past 15 minutes or so about how individuals can take action, the real thing in my estimate that the faith movement needs to do is to address the systemic issues here, and that by kind of religion claiming its identity, the way both Rabbi Jan and Reverend Arnold have made clear, by claiming our identity, we can shift these systems, and we can put our fingers on the interfaces between these systems and shift them. That's a heavy lift, but I think that's what the capacity of the faith community around the world is. There's a new initiative at the United Nations called Faith for Earth, which every person on this Zoom ought to be aware of. And the reason the UN is getting involved in faith, really, well, it's because 80% of the people living on the planet claim to be a person of faith. And that's why the UN is getting involved with it, in order then to leverage that power for systemic change. I'll leave it at that.
And actually, Rachel, I wanted to follow up on what I was saying, just some actual nuts and bolts. In the renewal community, we now have an ordination tract that is specific to environmental and ecological rabbiing. Okay, and there's also been a number of farms, of communities of Jews, young people. There's something called the Kesher Project, which is all young people. So, and I'm sure with my Christian and other colleagues, we are all seeing that the young people are coming forward and making their own organizations. They are our children. We raise them really well, you know. And so when they get to be out on their own, they absolutely want to be connected in an idealism that will move us all forward. The other thing that I want to say too is that a lot of what we're talking about comes out of being from a position of privilege. And I spent many years as a nutritionist teaching people how to shop in the grocery stores. And so much of what we buy, of course, you don't need, you know, and I can go off on that a lot. But how much choice do you have when the only store in your neighborhood is a little convenience store that only sells potato chips and beer? I mean, there's a profound structural inequality in access to consumer goods in this country. So that's a whole other kettle of fish there. But I just wanted you to know that young people are definitely making their way in the faith communities. Yeah.
Thanks. So I want to go to Ryan, who asked some great questions and has been waiting for a bit. Ryan, do you want to put your words together for a question here?
Sure. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. So yeah, I'm wondering if any of you, I guess, could speak to the limited access of those from low socioeconomic groups or low socioeconomic backgrounds. How could people without financial resources vote if they don't have the dollars to do so?
How can they vote if they don't have the dollars to do so?
You know, building on what I said, that every time you spend $1, it's a vote. I think that's what that you were going for. Yeah.
Well, for me, I think that's. Can I jump back to Rachel's question, and then I will try and answer your question from that basis. I think the church, first of all, especially the Christian church, has to confess its sin of racism. We actually, when we started to embrace the state, we became a part of the problem rather than the solution. And we became a part of the institution that supported and sustained slavery. And for, I think, the growing number, and I do sense and see a growing number of youth coming back into the church. And the reason for that is that we're not relying too much upon just the past to define what our priorities are. I encourage members who come into my church to understand each person as an embodiment of God's presence, and that we should not confine God to some white Anglo-Saxon looking power up in the sky, but that God is prevalent in each and every one of us in every aspect of creation. Yet we also need to determine what are the priorities of that God sense. And if that priority of where God is and how God is embodied is seen in the embodiment of justice and wholeness for every human being and every aspect of creation, then I think we come close to the realm of God on earth. And it's important to try and envision and pursue what that realm of God looks like on earth and pursue it. And when people own that sense of godness, that sense of divinity, I think we will start to see it as a tangible objective that we can actually achieve. Luther said that God is that greatest sense of hope, refuge, and strength in our lives. And he also said that that nobody is without a sense of God or divinity, because we often see God as mammon, money, power, and in all of its abundance. In some form or fashion, we create a sense of what is God, what is the most important priority in our lives, and we pursue it to the death. And if we can reclaim a sense of God as justice, as wholeness, as shalom for all of creation and every individual within it, then I think we're pursuing the right direction for the realm of God to be embodied here on earth. And in that sense, when we look at each individual as an embodiment of the divine, not just in a separate entity, but as a sense of community, as a sense of communion and wholeness, then I think it is our objective as faith communities to try and understand it is in our connectedness, in our sense of community, that we can be strong, that we can change unjust systems. And so voting becomes a communal act. You cannot assume that we are in this alone. The faith communities must rally around each and every individual in such a way that each and every individual can be empowered to achieve the objective of justice for all. So one's vote becomes a divine act of overcoming unjust systems.
I do want to circle back to Ryan's question about the concept of voting with your dollars and supporting those businesses that are providing a just service or product. How can we reconcile that with the fact that, Ryan, if I get your meaning here, the fact that those values sometimes come with the extra financial costs that it makes those purchases, that vote with your dollar idea, out of reach of many people.
Might I chip in here, please, Steve?
Please, yeah.
That it's not just voting with your dollars, but if you're living below the poverty line, it's voting with your labor as well, and that the role of unions in addressing these inequities is another matter of social justice that we've dealt with in other fora here. So it may be that you don't have the dollars in your pocket, but you do have the labor, something that we're seeing manifested in the role of frontline workers in this COVID crisis. Again, sorry to eat up your time.
No.
Wonder, can I respond?
Richard.
Yeah, this is Richard. Going to Ryan's question, I think coming to now, where we are right now, what is giving me a bit of hope is the fact that we've got a convergence of pandemic, economic crisis, environmental crisis. And I think the people in the faith communities need to get to work with their legislatures, and we need to make sure that we start passing minimum wage, guaranteed health care, and other things like that. It will give people who are at the lower end of the socioeconomic spectrum the ability to vote with their dollars. Right now, I agree with Ryan, when you're at the bitter edge of your funds every week, it doesn't matter. You go for the cheapest thing you can go for. But if we empower people with economic power, all people, then they're going to be able to make some different decisions. And it also, I think, will give people a sense of power. And I think we need to take this time right now and work really hard to make sure that people are paid a living wage, that they get health care, child care, and so on. Medical care, yeah.
Well, and just to add to what you said, Richard, the Green New Deal contains all of that and bundles it together. Right. That's why the United Church of Christ and the Unitarians both endorsed the Green New Deal within only a few months of when it was first proposed.
I agree.
The other thing that's really true,
Rabbi Salzman.
I'm sorry, the other thing that's really true is that if we look at examples of people who were at the very bottom, who realized that they were at the bottom and they weren't going to get any help. I'm thinking the urban farmer movement in Detroit, where Detroit had been completely devastated, emptied out, and there was nothing there. And people said, well, we got it, we're going to start growing our food. Or the people who saw that suddenly there was, and this is something that Shauna Ratner's book talks about, there is a huge untapped economic capital in our world that there are lots of ideas and there's lots of ways to fill the gaps that are people bonding together in community they have a shared interest, and then they come up with the idea of how to solve the problem, and then they just go ahead and do it, not asking anybody's permission. And so you're absolutely right. If I only have $15 a week to feed my family, I am in trouble. However, it's also true that what usually those numbers don't reflect is the economy that's existing underneath those dollars, where people are already taking care of each other. If you come from a people who are poor, there's a joke in Fiddler on the Roof, right? The example of Eastern European, and the beggar is knocking on the door because there was a role. There was actually a job in every village that you had a beggar, and the beggar would go around and collect the money and then distribute it to wherever it was needed. That was a job in the community. And so the joke is he knocks on the door, and the guy who answers the door says, I had a bad week, I can't give you any money. And the beggar says, if you had a bad week, why should I suffer? Okay, so there is huge amounts of untapped economic and social support that it's like the GDP. What do we count in our economy? We count the things that we're used to counting, but if you count the unpaid labor, if you count all of these other substrata of support that goes on, there is an incredible amount of stuff going on. And so I don't want to, all of supporting a minimum wage, making sure people have food, access to healthcare, all of those things are essential And I don't want to dismiss the power of people getting together and solving their own problems, no matter where they are on that socioeconomic scale. You know, there were no masks when this COVID began, and somebody saw that hole and began to make masks. And so, okay, I'll stop. I can go forever. All of us, we're preachers, you know, we could talk forever, so I'll just stop.
Well, that's another reason why I think, and this applies to the Black church as well, even though I think the Black church is becoming more and more integrated as it becomes more and more part of but this is where I think faith communities can learn a lot from the Black church, because the Black church emerged out of an agrarian, enslaved society where people literally had nothing, but came to each other in a sense of community to be empowered. And it is within that context of a faith community that they became political, that they became economic, and acclaimed their sense of empowerment through the integration of those various concerns and interests and entities into one structure. It is out of the Black church that the Black Power movement emerged. And so I think when I think of unions, for instance, especially unions organized by underprivileged labor, unions organized by people who find themselves marginalized, I think in many cases, this is just a secular manifestation of what the Black church is. These are people who have felt unempowered by the system, who find a sense of empowerment by their collective abilities to work together. And it is our present day society that is based on capital that wants to divide us in such a way that we feel unempowered, that we feel powerless. And it is only by and when the church buys into that capital structure, we defeat, I think, our purpose for being. In fact, I feel that whenever any faith community buys into that structure, we defeat our purpose for being. It is time we reclaimed our sense as a community that empowers the powerless, and it is only through that sense can we change the structure that is presently immoral. I truly believe it's immoral and has to be changed only by a sense of moral righteousness that can overturn this system.
It's not going to let go easily.
It's not.
What I'd like to do here, we're a little after 9 o'clock. What I'd like to do is go to each one of our speakers to see if you have a minute or two of closing comments before we wrap things up. But again, as I said earlier, we'll probably hang around for a little while after we officially close. Somebody want to jump in first?
Sure. One of the things that the man, Reb Zalman Schechter Shalomi of blessed memory, who was the Rebbe who began Jewish renewal, one of the things that he said so wisely was that we drive into the future looking in the rearview mirror. We got to check our rearview mirror as well as we drive forward. And while you were speaking, I was thinking of when certain immigrant groups came to this country, there were no hospitals that would serve them. There was no food services that would take care of them. And so they created their own hospitals. They created their own orphanages. They created their own food. And it not that we're going to, that kind, as I drive forward, I want to remember that I'm not disempowered. I've got these incredible examples of people who have come before me who had really hard situations and created their, as we used to say in the old hippie land, you know, they created their realities. And so I don't ever want to lose the image that we can solve these problems. And that's, I think, going back to the theme of this evening is, where do we find hope? And some of where I find hope is in this huge lateral conversation that we're all having, where everyone is finally getting on board to some of these like crazy problems that we're all facing with, that all come down to some of the very, very basic, similar impetus. which is inequality and lack of access and lack of respect, as Arnold said so beautifully, that if we forget that everything is in the image of God, we've lost it. And so my hope and my prayer and my yearning is that everything that we do, we get to see the spark of life that shines in everything. There's a Hasidic story that says that is that when everything was created, each blade of grass got its own little angel that stood above it and said, grow, 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 you know? And so there's this idea that we have a lot of support and support, maybe angelic, I don't know about that, but there's a lot of support here, and to not be afraid, right? Reb Nachman said, the whole world is a narrow bridge, and the key is to not be afraid to cross that bridge. Gesher Tsar Me'od. So I think that's all I want to say. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Reverend Thomas?
I'll go ahead, Arnold, and you can wrap us up. I've been thinking in advance of this, but also while we've been talking about the fact that we are talking in the midst of this horrible coronavirus pandemic, and yet there's a way in which there's some lessons that have become, I think, universally. We have been universally exposed to. I'm not suggesting we have universally learned them, but these lessons overlap, I believe, with climate change, which is much harder to wrap our heads around. And the first is that reality is real. And even though there's a bunch of people that are denying it right now, what's been happening in the last few weeks is America is waking up to the fact that because we have been denying that reality is real, we are in the worst situation of any country in the world. The second one is that speed really matters. And so just as was the case with climate change, Lyndon Johnson had put on his desk in 1965 the first report on climate change. And then James Hansen in 1988 made the first state testimony to Congress on climate change. And if we had addressed it earlier, we wouldn't have the catastrophic challenge we have right now. But I think COVID has taught us that because we didn't respond fast enough in the United States and thoroughly enough, we're in a mess. And then the third lesson is that social solidarity really matters also. The reason it's not just me that has to wear the mask, we all have to wear the mask, and we have to be in solidarity with each other. And it's the same with climate change. There's 195 countries, and we have to be in solidarity with each other. And the United States, as everybody on this call knows, is the only country that has pulled out of the Paris Climate Accords. So being reminded of those three things in a very present moment, I hope, will have an impact over the next several years in how the U.S. deals with climate change.
And I want to just close by saying that I want to again stress the interconnectedness of all that has been said between global warming, climate change, especially how it affects marginalized people of color, poor people. We need to find ways of connecting those entities in ways that empower every one of them to the reality that we are in this mess because we have given too much to the wealthy power brokers to determine the direction and course of our world. And it is time for that direction and course to be changed by those who have been left out, pushed out, shut out of the decision-making process. And I think we can do that as far as it's going to be a gradual process. It's going to be an uphill battle. It's interesting that Reverend Antal mentioned that Lyndon Johnson was the president who introduced the fact of a need for climate change legislation. He was also the one who provided a glimmer of hope for civil rights legislation in the Great Society. But all of that changed as he started prioritizing winning the war in Vietnam. And that really crushed our hopes, but we need to regain that sense of power and hope by redirecting the forces that have been taken away from us by the wealthy few. And I think we can do that. I think faith communities can provide the forum by which that happens and help create a direction by which it can occur.
If I may just jump in one more time, excuse me, but so the word COVID, right? So if you say it with a Jewish Yiddish accent, it's kavod, okay? So kavod is kavod, which means honor, heaviness, gravitas, honor. And so I've stopped saying COVID and I only say kavod, because I want to make this time a way to honor with great gravity and great honor and great heaviness the power that we have to turn this around and to really honor each other. You give someone else kavod. That's the way the word is used, and then kavod is this weightiness, usually attributed to God or something, but I just wanted to share that with you. How you say your words can sometimes change the meaning.
Well, thank you so much to our speakers. I just am feeling such a sense of community, and I just am so grateful that we have this space together. And I think the hope, the muscle that we're going to exercise is bringing this message to our loved ones and our friends and family, and continue to have these conversations, because this is just so enlightening and I appreciate it. So I also want to just thank everyone for attending. And Rob, I don't know if you want to share the next sessions that we've got. So we've been doing these community conversations every Wednesday night at 8 p.m. this summer. We've got one coming up on July 8th with the Vermont Climate and Health Alliance, and then July 22nd, the Vermont Healthy Soils. We also have one listed July 15th, but it's not listed here. But we're hosting every Wednesday, so please join these conversations. You can also find all of our past conversations on our YouTube channel and on our website. We've had a lot of really interesting discussions about environmental justice, COVID, and all of these intersectional issues. So thank you so much for making your time and spending your time with us this evening.